In all my found footage and mockumentary topics, the taking of DEBORAH Logan is probably the most recurring request I've had when it comes to quality approaches to the subgenre. I've heard a lot about it, but have never actually seen it, and so I decided to take everyone up on the recommendation, and after watching it, I guess the best way to describe it tonally and thematically is like The Last Exorcism meets The Autopsy of Jane Doe. It's a morbid yet softly sentimental premise about the reality of living and dealing with devastating progressive diseases, which according to director and co-writer Adam Rebital, is symbolically mirrored through its unraveling possession plot about innocent people torn apart by an unexpected evil they can't control. It follows a PhD medical student called Mia, who puts together a documentary crew to make a research piece on an Alzheimer's patient called Deborah, and how the disease has impacted the lives of both her and her daughter Sarah. There's a lot of emotional rawness to unpack before anything overtly terrifying happens, as our introduction to the Logans is portrayed with an uncomfortable level of strain and disconnect.
You hungry?
While Sarah projects a bubbly, welcoming, and enthusiastic persona, you can clearly see the pain in her eyes. By participating in the documentary, Sarah is being offered grant money to help pay grueling medical bills and facilitate her mother's overwhelming condition at the expense of exposing her challenging private life to curious watchers. However, I think the crew subconsciously provide a temporary comfort to Sarah by bringing a sense of normality back into Sarah's isolating home, living with a mother who is beginning to feel more and more like a stranger to her, and vice versa. As Rebital states, Sarah is the true heart of the story. In many ways, it's ultimately about her journey and her experiences witnessing her loving and caring mother lose her innocence and feel somewhat dehumanized by her increasing inability to look after herself or control her behavior. Now, for transparency, I've never had any first-hand experience dealing with someone with Alzheimer's, so my knowledge of it comes purely from the accounts I've seen and heard from others who have gone through what I can only assume to be one of life's most unimaginatively distressing and difficult ordeals. So in this respect, I'm not going to speak on behalf of the film's success at portraying Alzheimer's, but what I do think is interesting is how Adam Rebital approaches such a sensitive subject matter that eventually moves into blatant supernatural territory. Rebital explained in a 2014 interview that he was fully aware of how exploitative the film could appear by using supernatural possession as a metaphor for progressive diseases like Alzheimer's and cancer, as the patient loses control of themselves and slowly begins to weaken as their body fights back against the illness. As such, Rebital states that the goal was to treat Deborah with dignity and give as much of an authentic and informed portrayal of the disease as possible before moving into more fantastical aspects of the story. In his words, we wanted the audience to have the discussions and start a conversation, but we're very mindful that it needed to go more into the expressionistic horror to provide the escape valve of entertainment. In other words, there is a distinction between showing the horrors of real life and demonstrating how those experiences inform the independent fantasy. Horror has always been used as a way to explore real issues, but the best ones do so when they don't undermine the complexity of the issue by constantly forcing the metaphor or stigmatizing, contradicting, or, God forbid, glorifying the issue. Most of them are generally passive or neutral in their approach to maintain respect, but regardless of how much we attempt to intellectualize it, for many people these films do provide catharsis and a meaningful coping mechanism because it speaks directly to their fears and worries. Before even the lingering implication of anything supernatural, the fear comes from how challenging Deborah's deteriorating condition is, that you're not made to be scared of her, but rather for her. I guess you could say Deborah is upsettingly scary. There is both a tenderness to her character and a poignant portrait given of her life, and so seeing her slowly wither away before her daughter's eyes as she tries so hard to recall lost memories of her early years makes for a haunting watch, especially if you can relate to the experience of seeing someone you care about no longer being the person they once were because of mental or physical conditions. One of the visual motifs that really accentuates the tragedy is Deborah's paintings. They're colourful visions looking to hold onto the world, and they arguably symbolise a glimmer of hope for Sarah that her mother has found peace. Yet you'll come to realise they mean something else entirely. I love that the film places very little emphasis on the documentary crew compared to other films within the subgenre, because the absolute focus of the story is and should always be on Deborah and Sarah. We sympathise deeply with them and are heartbroken by how much of a toll it's had on their lives emotionally and financially, that the worry doesn't come from what Deborah will do to the characters, it's what Deborah might do to herself. I think focusing too much on the crew would derail the relationship between the mother and daughter and the passing on of a generation, as Sarah takes on many of her mother's personal attributes and quirks, showing that when the inevitable happens, the spirit of her mother will always live on through her. In a broader sense, the film taps into that subconscious fear children feel towards their loving parents as they get older, and the fragility of time itself, especially since Sarah even wears her father's jacket, having never truly known him before his death when she was young. However, there's a sense of deliberate exploit written into the story where the film crew show both indifference and generally a shitty attitude towards everything. You can tell the documentary crew have no interest towards the issue, while Mia is basically doing this for no other reason than to benefit her PhD. Yeah, she's curious because it's her subject of specialty, and at the end of the day, it is her job to capture this experience, but when she straight up lies about her grandfather having the disease to manipulate Deborah into participating, you get the impression she doesn't respect the issue on a pure human level.
She just needed a little nudging.
The problem is, it doesn't go anywhere with this and fails to have much of a point other than to show Mia progressing more sympathetically, but ultimately she's pretty much irrelevant to the story other than being the audience's outside perspective. Now, moving on to the supernatural stuff, it takes a unique turn that still retains thematic relevance, but this involves entering some spoiler territory. Although, just a heads up, I'm not going to spoil the ending right away just in case you'll want to stick around longer, and if you do plan on leaving, please remember to feed the algorithm gods with a comment below and let me know what future videos you want to see. Okay, let's move on. So basically, Sarah discovers after an exposition dumping documentary that Deborah is possessed by Henri Desjardins, a French doctor diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease, who tried to achieve immortality by performing a ritual that involved devouring 5 girls injected with snake venom, but went missing before he succeeded at murdering the 5th girl. What happened to Desjardins, you ask? Well, Deborah fucked him up and buried his body in the garden opposite the house with the help of her best friend Harris in order to protect Sarah, who was meant to be Desjardins' 5th and final victim. As such, Desjardins possessed Deborah in a bid to finish the ritual and take over the body of another host, prompting Deborah to kidnap a child suffering from severe cancer. It essentially adds a frightening new level of tragedy to the story, as yes, Deborah does have Alzheimer's, but her weakened state allows for what the film calls a spiritual parasite to invade her body as it seeks a new host. What it does is recontextualizes all of Deborah's behaviour up to this point, as it's implied she's constantly trying to fight back against the possession and attempting to recall memories to communicate Desjardins' presence. She even attempts to get Harris to euthanize her, reinforcing just how trapped, helpless, and aware Deborah has been throughout the story. If you didn't see Rebidal's metaphor then, you'll sure as hell see it now, as the film has a surprisingly natural transition that still maintains the reality and, as Rebidal said, the dignity of Sarah's condition, while implementing the possession in a clever and meaningful way that's not as generic or uninspired as the dozens of films within this particular subgenre. The reason for this comes down to a significant subtextual point that's easy to miss when, in a very brief scene, Sarah tries to have a priest perform an exorcism on Deborah, but he refuses and encourages Sarah to accept her mother's condition. At this point, with Deborah in her worst state, the outward assumption is that Sarah is now desperately and somewhat irrationally driven to find a way to overcome something that is fundamentally incurable. It conveys a shattering sense of hopelessness we feel when death is close, and both science and faith provide no immediate solution. Sarah is told she can burn Deardine's corpse to relieve the spirit, which was the case when a mother in Africa was possessed by her deceased son, but rather than this being directly an exposition dump leading to a Deus Ex Machina, it very much maintains the implication that there is no certainty it will work. Instead of getting caught up in this incredibly fascinating supernatural plot, I find myself more engaged by this sense of futility that Sarah is in denial and trying to suppress the inevitable. It felt very tonally aligned with the grounded narrative that came before it. However, and this is a relatively big however, I'm honestly not a fan of the ending, and it echoes the same thoughts I had towards the last Exorcism's climax. It's not that I don't think it works dramatically, it's great, it's that I think it's rushed, incomplete, and somewhat underdeveloped. So there's a crescendo to this big, unholy what the fuck of a reveal where Deborah tries to devour the child, but it doesn't help that I literally know nothing about this child. Of course, seeing a child in danger is inherently shocking, but within the context of the story, she's just a human prop to facilitate the supernatural climax, which feels oddly out of place for a film that is so incredibly character-driven. The premise of a child with terminal cancer and her parents grieving is a powerful subject, but it goes completely unexplored, obviously because it's a found footage film, when it could have served as an emotional contrast to Sarah and Deborah. Like the African story of the grieving mother possessed by her dead child, the film does introduce that opposite perspective of a child witnessing their parents grow older, by presenting the harrowing notion that a parent should never see their child die. Seeing that Sarah's plan doesn't work and Deardine has possessed the child does little for me. It's a bit cheap when all this real emotional weight is never decompressed. To me, the real frustration is that we don't even get an aftermath with Sarah, who I thought was meant to be the heart of the story. It has no reason to be this ambiguous about it, it just sort of ends. And I will concede that a lot of this is down to my growing cynicism towards found footage endings. I expect there to be a lot of disagreement, and that's exactly what the comments are for, so make sure to leave your personal thoughts on the taking of Deborah Logan below, and let me know what you want me to cover next time. And until then, stay safe, stay away from snakes, and I'll see you all next time.